Good evening, and welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where I'm very pleased to welcome to the program Mr. Edward Luck. And Mr. Luck is the president of a long-standing and interesting organization called the United Nations Association for the United States. And Mr. Luck, Edward, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And if I might take a second and say again that this evening's program is being co-hosted again with Marilyn Mock Vos Savant. And again, Marilyn, welcome very much. Very nice to have you here indeed. I wonder if you might, Edward, share with us a little bit the historical development of the association. It goes back almost to the beginning of the UN itself, and
right.
The concept goes back, I guess.
It goes back to the dream of an international organization that could resolve some of the problems that individual nation-states can't. There was a League of Nations Association in this country for many years. And then after World War II, the founding of the UN, Eleanor Roosevelt was our first president. And we are a broad spectrum organization, Republicans, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, all of whom would like to see the UN a stronger organization with a strong, effective U.S. presence there.
I see. And
so we don't have a particular political message to sell, but we are very interested in public education. We have membership around the country. We also do a great deal of research and international exchange programs.
You do have a commonality of interest, as it were, in the sense of the notion of the UN and wanting to strengthen the concept of international cooperation through the UN, which a great number of people do. Some don't. Some people take objection to the United Nations and our role in it and so forth. But generally you have a shared sense of wanting to strengthen that United Nations and the concept of the nations working in concert if they can.
That's right. We'd like to make it work. I mean, no one really questions the ideal. That would be wonderful to have international organizations that really could address many of the tough problems: security, disarmament, human rights, peacekeeping, development, humanitarian questions. But the problem is that for a variety of reasons, it's been very hard to make it an effective organization. And we would like to do what we can to help on that, because I think most Americans, and the public opinion polls show that, believe in the concept. And it shows 89, 90% in every poll of Americans want the U.S. to remain in the UN, even though more and more Americans are disappointed with it.
Yeah,
so we think it's a kind of message that can appeal to a very broad spectrum of the American public.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. I wondered, could we go back historically, the attitude nationally toward the League of Nations? And when we were in the League of Nations and the international sense of things, are we becoming more and more, as a nation, individuals within the nation, the leadership and the general citizenry, comfortable with the notion of living within this international order of things than maybe we were at the time of the League of Nations? Or just historically, do you get a sense of that?
Well, there's been quite a difference. Of course, the U.S. never joined the League.
Yeah, right.
And that was one reason it failed. And also, the League was never really given the power to accomplish anything very much. It was really an ideal without any instrumentation to carry it out. And so after World War II, there was a sense, very strongly in this country in particular, but shared with other countries as well, that we have to do better, that we have to create some institutions that can be a buffer between small conflicts and global conflagration. That we have to have an organization that can promote human rights around the world, that can help with the process of decolonization. And it has done all of those things. But I think people recognize in this country, more than ever, the need for this kind of organization. And the public opinion polls show, for all the criticism, that more Americans now want the U.S. to remain in the UN than at any time in its history. That in fact it was least popular in that sense in the early 50s, at the time of the Korean War, when in essence the UN was carrying our own battle in Korea for us.
Also the time of McCarthy.
That's right. I think that had a lot to do with it. And that was a time of a certain amount of isolationism too, and the growing Cold War with the Soviet Union. But at this point people recognize that in terms of economic interdependence, the need for markets abroad, that you need some kind of international mechanism. We can't escape it. We're more and more dependent on other countries. And a lot of the problems that bother us most, whether it's terrorism, for example, or development, we simply can't do it on our own. We have to work with other countries. But at the same time, we see more and more that people are disillusioned with the UN. They are disappointed in it because we have high expectations. And the UN is not the only institution we're disappointed in. We're disappointed in the presidency most of the time. Congress gets very low ratings. City government, this city in particular, is getting increasingly low ratings for good reasons. And it really is a question that Americans are looking at institutions and expecting a great deal of them.
Well, by virtue of certain powers having extra sway, let's say, in the UN, does it not establish sort of a basic position which may indeed be our position? For example, when you mentioned a need to decolonize. This is something that the United States would feel, but not necessarily other countries. And so does your organization in encouraging the United States to retain an important position in the UN, does it actually also intend to try to sway, influence, or encourage the UN in general?
Well, in fact, we have programs with other countries. We are not simply devoted to the United States or to addressing our own policies here.
This would be your organization specifically?
Organization. There are, in fact, similar organizations in 65 countries.
Oh, and these would be your
there's a
sister,
World
brother, or
Federation.
brother related?
That's right, that's right.
I
Some
see.
of them are quite different than ours, but we do have a number of common programs with them. For example, we're having a major conference with the Western European and Japanese and Canadian representatives to talk about what common initiatives the Western countries can put together in the UN, because there's been a tendency to see a very sharp rift between the United States on the one hand and our allies on the other. And if we can't bring our allies on board, we're certainly not going to bring on the Third World or the socialist countries. We also have exchanges with the Soviet Union, with China, with Japan. And we're talking with those countries about what they might be able to do. And with the case of the Soviet Union, we express some of the differences of opinion we have with them. But after all, this organization was a common heritage of the U.S. and Soviet Union. We were really the two midwives for the UN. Now, with the Soviet-American problems, they are now transformed onto the world scene. In fact, we block very much what the UN could do because of disagreement between the two superpowers. So we see ourselves as a national organization in terms of our national membership, and our primary audience is in the United States. But we certainly recognize that the problem is a global one, and we try to deal with other countries as well.
Well, with your organization in general, does it see the role of the UN eventually as encouraging something like a one-world society, so we don't have all the multinational problems that we do have now?
Well, I'm not sure that we're quite that visionary. I think some of our members may embrace that. As I say, we have quite a diversity politically in our organization.
Well, it does make a difference in voting.
Well, it does, but I think many of us in the association, I would say probably most of us, feel that we're probably not going to get to that point. And some of us worry about what would happen if you had a single world government. What if that particular government happened to be corrupt or happened to adopt values that might persecute civil rights of their people, for example? Or what if that depended on a single leader and that leader happened to not be such a good choice? There is, I think, a good reason to, in fact, encourage diversity in the world. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the differences in cultures, the differences in philosophies, the differences in political systems can be quite healthy.
If it were up to you, then, would you have everyone in the world speaking one language? Disregarding what language that would be, let's say we would have to make one up. But, so then you think it is healthy for people to be as different as they are?
I think it is. I think in terms of the single language, you're finding English is almost becoming the universal language because of commerce and because of so many other things. But frankly, I think the problem is not diversity. The problem is living with diversity, not trying to eliminate it. There's no reason that countries with different cultures can't live together. What happens is sometimes the ideologies and the political systems become such that they're very uncomfortable with neighbors or other countries that have different beliefs. And in fact, it often is those who are trying to impose a single belief system on the world who cause many of the problems and are very aggressive because they feel if they can't deliver their message around the world through peaceful means and they can't persuade people, then they do it through military. So I'm not really a believer in a single government.
So it wouldn't be at all appropriate for us to take the example of our republic, where we were struggling under the Articles of Confederation for the first few years. Each nation, each state having its own tariffs, each state having its own banking system, each state having different economic interests, and that the vision of the Founding Fathers was to establish a more overriding federalist vision of a political organization. Of course, there were great centripetal forces of language and so forth within our nation, but you don't see that as a potential model for the emergence on the world order, to where the seeming divergencies of the various interests geographically, geopolitically, and so forth. Do you understand what I'm saying as an example?
No,
we could
I
move toward an
understand.
increasingly, if not increasingly federated, or a sense of federation, as perhaps even as the international economic realities become more and more obviously making it an interdependent order.
There are other organizations like the World Federalists, for example, who very much look to that model and think that you move step by step towards eventual single government. As I say, that's really not my philosophy. My own sense is that at the time of the Articles of Federation in this country, you had a common belief system, a common sense of values, which really, by and large, covered the whole of the colonies. And there was a great impulse to unite. The differences were, by and large, those of power and politics and revenues and how one would go about structuring it. But there wasn't a basic difference, for example, between the kind of belief system we might have in this country and those that they might have in China or the Soviet Union or in Chad or in China.
But
No,
that is the
diversity
point.
is
That is
so
the,
much
that,
more.
but
we
that
did
was
have a
the
problem
point.
with the North and South.
Well, that's true. We had a tremendous problem in our Civil War over economic things. But the point is that there is a commonality, increased commonality. I mean, it used to be Ben Franklin took 3 months to get to Europe, and now we do it in a nanosecond on a thing. I mean, the international order is becoming that way, that we might be leading more toward a world where there's a greater degree of understanding among the various things. There was a serious attempt in the Declaration of Human Rights itself that was a universalist order. The Charter of the UN was attempting to gain a political agreement among diverse segments, diverse political views, diverse cultural views. The challenge in and of itself of the United Nations, inevitably, just in and of itself, was one that was trying to try and find certain kinds of unity out of what was given as a diversity.
It was
I mean, that's
trying
inherent
to
in
look for some common, cohesive values that different countries could share. But if you look at many of those, they have to do with how countries can continue to coexist peacefully. They didn't have to do so much with having to merge. And the problem comes in with security, defense, questions of that sort, which make it very, very difficult. And you mentioned the possibility here of a civil war. Well, I think what you would end up is having a series of what would be called civil wars rather than international wars. But the differences would still be there. I mean, I don't think the world is
arose
ready.
by any other name.
That's
Yes.
right. That's right. I don't think the world is ready simply to assume that you can take that step, that you can simply impose that kind of a structure on the world. I don't think it's ready for it. It may get to that point someday.
Do you think
but I don't think as long as I'm going to be here.
Sorry, I'm wondering, do you think some of the loss of support for it generally that you do say is now in the United States is growing out of that fear that our sovereignty, in the sense of the sovereignty of the United States to which most people pledge their allegiance, and even on what some would see as jingoism, and the emergence of nationalism as a reinforced political concept on the world scale and so forth, is the source of the sense of discontent with the United Nations, that our sovereignty, our ability to perform in a sovereign way is being superseded by our commitment to this world order?
I
not. No. What is the source of
the
discontent with the United Nations?
When you ask people in various polls, and we've done some, and Roper and organizations done some for us, and Gallup and the other ones, and you look at that question, and you don't find that people find, by and large, you're saying the UN is a hostile organization, or that it's an organization that's trying to encroach on our sovereignty, as you suggest. What they seem to say is it's an organization that is tending towards impotence. In fact, it doesn't have the power to exert its will on other countries. And that's been one of the conflicts within the organization. There was an assumption, I think, on the part of many Americans when it was founded, that there were common interests among all the major powers that would hold and bind them together. And of course, immediately you had the Cold War. You discovered that indeed there were crucial differences between the way, and certainly the two major powers after World War II viewed the world and what they wanted and what their interests were. So it isn't so much that the UN has been too strong, but I think people have been concerned that it's been too weak.
Yeah, it's not
because
effective.
it's in fact that internal contradiction within the organization that's made it very difficult to deal with, for example, issues of the Middle East or Southern Africa, peace and security issues. And where the UN has been enormously successful has been in questions of development, decolonization, questions of humanitarian aid to the third world, for
UNICEF,
example. UNDP, the whole African famine. George Bush was fairly recently over in Africa. He came back just singing the praises of the UN efforts in that area. But unfortunately, that isn't the image of the UN that the American people have. They thought it was an organization that was going to make the world safe for democracy and was going to resolve all conflict in the world. And of course, that is impossible. And our government, no more than any other government, was willing to cede to the UN those kinds of powers that indeed would encroach upon its sovereignty.
And of course, by powers, that's a partisan view, of course, making the world safe for democracy. Naturally, the USSR could say, make it safe for communism.
For socialist democracy, for their own
Yeah,
version
but
of it.
all the world will claim democracy as their own, won't
Yeah,
they? Almost these days.
I hear many
there's
people.
no one is.
I'm sorry. I hear many people in this country say that You know, democratic values and democracy were at the heart of the UN Charter. Democracy isn't mentioned in the UN Charter. The word is not used.
Yeah.
A lot of questions of human rights.
And that is as it should be,
Yeah.
wouldn't
well,
you say?
Well, I would say
otherwise it would
as,
be
as
our
a global
organization.
document. That's right. I mean, if it's
course.
simply an American organization, it's not a universal one.
Yeah,
You
it's
mentioned.
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You mentioned that the public perceives the UN as growing increasingly impotent, and I noticed that in the article you wrote, the editorial in the New York Times that appeared April 4th, you mentioned beginning the United Nations is rapidly going bankrupt. Although when I continued to read, I didn't see a lot about the financial aspects of it, and I was wondering if those two are related. Is the public perhaps they are both the case, but unrelated? I don't know.
Well, what has happened is that a number of countries over the years have not been paying their dues to the UN.
Yes.
The Soviet Union, in particular, because of peacekeeping operations, which they feel go beyond the rights and responsibilities of the UN, which they feel they don't have enough control of. So they have not been given money for that. And the U.S., for this little purpose and that little purpose they didn't like about the UN, has had small withholdings. Now, all of a sudden, the U.S. is talking about a massive withholding of 40 to 50% of our assessed contributions.
Yes, I've heard
And
this
that,
is a violation.
on top of it's a distinct violation of our treaty obligations. The UN Charter is an international treaty ratified by the U.S. Senate overwhelmingly. I think there are only 2 votes against it. And now, all of a sudden, we're deciding for domestic political reasons that it's more convenient not to pay our dues. I mean, you could imagine what would happen in this country if each citizen decided, A, they could decide how much they were going to pay, and when they were going to pay it, and for which programs of the U.S. government they were going to pay. We'd have
Yes,
utter
and if they
chaos.
were going to pay, yes.
And you talk about the UN as a powerful organization encroaching on our sovereignty, well, it doesn't even have the funds to pay its bills. And there's a fair chance by October that it will simply go completely bankrupt.
The United
its
Nations
reserves
would
are
go,
used up.
it would go completely bankrupt?
Well, its reserves are used up. They're having a special meeting of the General Assembly in April, an emergency financial meeting to find out what they can do. They've been cutting staff. They've been cutting programs. They put a freeze on hiring. They put a freeze on wages. They've done a number of things to keep the UN budget down.
That is really disquieting in an era where there is such power at the hands of our geopolitical leadership and so forth, incredible, unprecedented power, and that the UN does serve as a common ground for there to be discussion, meetings, and so forth. It's an important role that it does play, so that really is disquieting in that broad sense.
Well, I obviously find it that way.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at it, for each American, there's less than $4 contributed by our government to the UN. Now, it seems to me that that covers all of the development programs. It covers all the human rights programs. It covers the UN inspections of international nuclear facilities around the world. It covers all of the forums and deliberations that you mentioned. It covers the specialized agencies, UNICEF, the work for children around the world. It covers things like the Women's Conference this last year in Nairobi, which has been very important in putting forward the idea of women's rights around the country. And it, to my mind, is simply mind-boggling that one could consider this to be an economy move on the part of the United States.
And
because
particularly,
these are pennies. These are pennies compared to the rest of the U.S. budget.
indeed, and also provides a meeting ground for perhaps a meeting ground of last resort or a meeting ground
Sometimes
for the
for first
geopolitical
resort.
leadership of the world.
There are
that
many
is
countries
there, right?
that don't have relations.
Ideally,
for example,
it would
the
be for
Soviet
first
Union
resort.
and Israel. Israel finds its seat in the UN is absolutely essential for it, and it wouldn't give it up for the world.
Yeah.
And it's been very concerned about these U.S. trends. In fact, things are becoming better for Israel within the UN. But it otherwise wouldn't have any place to meet with the Soviets, for example, about problems that they're concerned about.
Well,
In
what
this,
is it? What is the major rationale for this stance now? An economy
There's a
measure to
series-
cut down the
there's a series
deficit or
of-
something,
there are
or
three
is
or-
it ideological?
Well, it's a little bit of both, I think. There is a series of pieces of legislation. One is the Kassenbaum Amendment, introduced by Senator Kassenbaum, which demands that the UN General Assembly adopt weighted voting on financial issues based on how much money you give. So the wealthier countries which give more money to the UN should have more say in how the money is spent. As it is, we have a tremendous amount of influence over this, this question of how money is spent. But this particular amendment would require changing the UN Charter, which is almost impossible to do because it requires 2/3 of the countries to agree. And it requires all of the permanent members, the Soviet Union, China, Great Britain, France, the United States, all to agree on this. And it simply isn't possible. And unless that is done, the amendment says that the U.S. will not pay 20% of our contributions to the UN. Then there's a second problem, the Sundquist Amendment, which completely arbitrarily, no one knows where the figure came from, is withholding another $20 or $21 million from the UN because some UN Secretariat people from various countries return part of their salaries to their national missions, which I think is entirely inappropriate. But the UN itself really has a very hard time policing that. It's between the individual members and their secretariats. So that's another $21 million. Then there's the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act, which frankly should not apply to the UN because the UN is a pre-existing treaty, and domestic legislation can only override an existing treaty if it says that is the intent of the legislation. And there has been no effort under Gramm-Rudman to say it's aimed to overriding existing treaty obligations. And in fact, Gramm-Rudman would only withhold from the UN properly 4.3% of its budget, because that's the across-the-board U.S. budget cut on that. Instead, they're withholding 7%. And if you put it all together, it comes up to 40 or 50% of the U.S. contributions.
It's a it's a very, very bad example for the leading contributor to bank, isn't it? I mean, on an international scale, there'll be a roll-through of the whole international system.
Think so.
That would be
the benefits that we get from the organization are absolutely enormous. In fact, on a number of these, for example, the Kassenbaum and Sundquist amendments, the President expressed very strong misgivings about them. We questioned their constitutionality. He said they would harm UN agencies that are doing very good work for U.S. national interests. But they went ahead anyway. And I think getting back to one of your early questions about why does this happen, it's partly because there's very broad support for the UN in this country, but it's very thin. The people who seem to care most about the UN are those who like it the least. People in groups like the Heritage Foundation and What's Left of the John Birch Society, and people who are basically isolationists and who are basically very negative towards any sense of international cooperation. And they've been looking for a way to go after the UN for years and years, and now they found it.
When you mentioned the financial troubles, I'm not sure in what context that this is mentioned, but you did say that having suffered repeated setbacks at the hands of the third world majority. In what sense?
That reference was two General Assembly resolutions. The General Assembly is the one part of the UN that everyone in this country seems to focus on. But for my money, it is not anywhere nearly the most important part of the organization. A very small part of the funds are spent there. It does not have the power to direct most of the specialized agencies, which have their own boards, their own governing bodies, and they do most of the work of the organization. It cannot force the UN to move in terms of peacekeeping or conflict resolution in particular areas. That is done by the Security Council, where we have a veto. So the General Assembly is an organ where the majority of states, small, impoverished, relatively new states, express their will.
So they can make themselves heard, and we get a lot of media attention
that's right.
there.
And of course, their view is very different than those of the U.S., the Soviet Union, the established powers, and many things. And so they pass a lot of resolutions that we don't like, many that the Soviets don't like. There has been a big improvement in recent years. They don't so often resort to anti-American or anti-Israeli rhetoric. That's by and large has been a thing of the past. And people think of the UN in the way that it was back in the mid-'70s, when there was a great deal of confrontation in the General Assembly. It was a very tough time for the U.S. and our friends. But that's greatly improved. And I think we have to give some credit to this administration. They have done a good job of talking back to the really negative rhetoric from the Third World, and really calming down the forum in the General Assembly.
So would you say this administration has been good for the UN?
I'm not sure I would go that far. But I think in some ways they've taken it very seriously. And I think they have undertaken a number of initiatives that are very helpful. But we're a nonpartisan organization, and we don't try to put report card grades on administrations, Republican or Democratic.
Is
in
this
fact,
attitude...
I should probably mention, we get funding neither from the U.S. government nor from the UN. We're entirely funded
Yeah,
independently.
you are. We're talking the attitude toward the UN itself. Is that mirrored by the international community to the degree that that attitude is being expressed domestically here in the United States? Is there a mirroring of that attitude on the part of the international community?
I sometimes think that our government is a little more negative on the UN than our public opinion is. In some European countries, I think it's the other way around. There is a lot of discontent expressed in public opinion polls, but the governments remain very supportive of the UN. And in fact, the 12 countries of the European community, in a rather unusual act recently, sent a very strong letter of protest to the Secretary of State about the U.S. cutbacks, and saying don't look for them to make up the difference. They're continuing to pay their dues properly, and the U.S. should, as a leader, should live up to our own treaty obligations.
We asked you earlier on, if you could, whether or not it's leading to confederation, but if one looks beyond, let's say, the nation state as a basic unit in Reinhold Niebuhr's perception, general traditional views of geopolitics and so forth, and some sort of a form. The United Nations really is, on a world scale. There are other international perspectives and world perspective organizations and so forth, but that's our major hope in terms of an international forum and meeting place for the nations of the world. And there's a tremendous institutional commitment to that, and it would be, to put it mildly, a tremendous loss to the prospects for the human society were that to somehow default, wouldn't it?
I mean, destroy institutions and create them.
Indeed.
I don't think we're, again, see the kind of climate we had after World War II that allowed the U.S. and Soviet Union to sit down and create this kind of an institution. That's
which makes it all the more valuable now, in a certain sense.
I certainly think so.
It should be shored up, by all means, rather than in a certain sense attacked. Don't you?
Right.
You would agree,
Oh,
obviously.
definitely.
Yeah.
Given the increase in global communication, the amount of trade, the amount of travel back and forth, what we're finding, whether it's environment, terrorism, whatever, we're finding problems that involve every country and affect every country. And you need these kinds of forums to bring them together. And I think it's so short-sighted not to recognize that in the long term, we need these kinds of institutions for our own national interests.
Yeah, indeed. It does serve our own national interests well.
One of the goals that you mentioned, I believe it was goals, and I hope I haven't said this wrong, is that making the world safe for disarmament.
Right.
Now, of course, that begs the question, does that mean then a limited disarmament?
Well, that particular reference was to the concept that if you are really concerned about peace and security, and you really want to be sure we don't have a World War III, you've got to stop all those small conflicts that break out around the world. You have to have some kind of break on the ladder of escalation. And that's where the UN comes into play. It's nice to have arms control and disarmament treaties. In fact, I'm a specialist in the area of arms control.
Like
I
a fire
think
break?
it's extraordinarily important. But you need a fire break. You need a buffer. You need some kind of institution that can send in peacekeeping forces that will keep the two parties apart in a conflict. You need a neutral mechanism for mediating a conflict. The UN is the only organization which simultaneously can conduct negotiations on the question of Afghanistan, in case the Soviets ever decide to stop their carnage and brutality there, that can work between Iran and Iraq looking for a solution there, that has a plan for Southern Africa for peace there. No one else can do that. And you need that kind of a neutral forum. And that was what the UN was set up to do. And it's nice to talk in the abstract about nuclear disarmament and this and that, but you've got to stop conflict, because it's conflict that will lead to World War III. It's not the possession of weapons, it's their use. And that is what the UN was set up to do something about.
And
that's why we should be using it more and trying to strengthen it. As it is, we tend to go to there only as the last resort. Look at the question of Lebanon. So many of our own servicemen were killed there because we didn't use UN peacekeeping forces. If we were ready, they would have gone. A neutral force that would not have been attacked. More Americans were killed in that one operation than in all UN peacekeeping forces around the world in all these years in Kashmir and Cyprus, Belgian Congo, whatever.
Yeah, it's a tremendous challenge. It is, and it's one that confronts us all, and it's one we all have to address ourselves to. Disquieting to hear the financial difficulties and others and the general lack of support. I am sorry we could go on talking at great length. I'm sorry we're running out of time for this segment, but it's a great pleasure talking with you, and we certainly would like to lend support in any kind of way that we're able to do, and towards the efforts that you can see in helping to shore up that institution, which is such a crucial one at this particular and crucial time, as it were. But I'm sorry we run out of time for this particular segment.
Well, we appreciate your sentiments. Thank you very much.
Not at all. May I thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you.
And I would remind you again, in the cable television audience, it has been your pleasure to have the perceptions then of Edward Luck, who is the president of the UN Association for the United States of America, talking in broad general terms about this institution. And we will be coming back momentarily with more in the same general topic area momentarily, for which we'd ask you to stay tuned. Remind you again, the program is being hosted this week with Marilyn Mock, both savant. We're coming right back. Please stay tuned. Mr. Luck, Edward, if I may, thank you once again very much for all your work and particularly participating here in the series.
Thank you very much.
Please stay tuned. We'll be coming right back. Welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where we're pleased and honored to welcome to the program Vladimir Shustov. And Mr. Shustov is the Deputy Permanent Representative from the Soviet Union to the United Nations. And Mr. Shustov, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
You've been at the United Nations for a considerable period of time yourself, and of course the Soviet Union has been involved with the United Nations from its inception. I wonder, is there a perception among the Soviet citizenry and the Soviet leadership comparable to those within the American society that have trouble with the concept of the United Nations itself? And we've been discussing here the future of the United Nations. Could you give us a general feeling for the Soviet citizenry toward the institution, the United Nations, and perhaps compare it some to the varied attitudes we have here within the United States? But just give us a general reading, if you could, from the Soviet society's perspective of the United Nations as an institution.
You see, the perception of the United Nations in our country is a rather stable one. From the very inception of this organization, we considered and regarded the United Nations as a very useful instrument of maintaining peace and strengthening international security in the world. Certainly we understood realistically all the possibilities of the organization, but we always thought that the United Nations could serve as a really important instrument for reaching these two objectives, international peace and security. And this approach of ours hasn't changed from 1945, when the UN was set up, until the present day. And we think that, if to speak about the future, that the role of the United Nations may be increased. But I can explain that in the meantime, we see that know very well the cases when the UN efforts were not sufficiently effective and efficient, because not all the time the members of the United Nations fulfill their obligations taken by them under the Charter of the United Nations.
When you mention fulfilling the obligations, certainly dues is one of them, and now it is a serious problem. I wonder if the dues problem is inherent in the very structure of the United Nations, meaning that there are buildings to maintain, there are employees, staff, etc. And I'm wondering how much thought has there been given to the possibility of accomplishing something near this via satellite, so the physical presence of people in the other countries would not be required?
I don't think that the deficiencies should be explained by the structural shortcomings of the organization, because the Charter of the United Nations give every foundation for useful utilization of the opportunities of the United Nations. For example, in Article 2, you have paragraph 3 and 4, which relate to the non-use of force. But there is one country now, and I mean the United States, which violates this article and uses force against small, independent, non-aligned states like Libya, which is being condemned in the United Nations. But what other countries can do in this case except using political means against the United States? And you know that now the question is under consideration in the Security Council. About the physical presence of the representatives of different countries and the use of satellites. Certainly satellites will be used by the United Nations for different purposes. Maybe if we come to an agreement to abolish, to prevent arms race in outer space, and to cancel such projects like SDI. Maybe in this situation we'll use satellites for monitoring the fulfillment of this agreement. Then there could be conferences conducted through satellites. Perhaps you remember that about this fall, or it was in November actually, there was through satellite arranged a direct conversation between the 5 continents, where the leaders of 6 known countries were getting the Beyond War Prize, and they exchanged views on a very urgent issue, the cessation of nuclear weapons test ban.
So we could utilize communications technology.
Yes, but it will not replace the United Nations, I think, because the direct human contacts between the delegations, diplomats from different countries are very important.
Yeah.
I can see that, but then the dues issue
That's
always
right.
will
That's
remain
right.
a problem.
And
then.
from this viewpoint, you see, the United Nations is a very convenient organization. It's a very, the communications in the United Nations are, I should say, very democratic, because a junior diplomat may come up to the ambassador and start talking to him, which is impossible, almost
Oh, yes.
impossible in bilateral relations. Then UN gives an opportunity to meet the countries, for the countries which don't have diplomatic relations. And all the relations are very tense. For example, unfortunately, in the history of our relations, I mean between the United States and Soviet Union, there were very difficult moments, and now we are facing that also. But even during such periods, our foreign ministers could meet here within the framework of the United Nations and could discuss problems for many hours.
Yeah, in the long term, that might be ultimately the most important function of the United Nations, is there to be a meeting place where the nations of the world, with their sovereign differences and so forth, can have a point of discussion, and people who could feel as though they could lodge a protest or something of that sort, and have a place where their voice could be heard. And it's that aspect of the United Nations that perhaps is the most important one, apart from the ongoing activities and so forth of the institution, which is served well. But that meeting ground for the nations of the world to have some place other than just their sovereign activity is really important.
That's right.
Don't you think?
That's right. It's a very sound conclusion based on the historical experience. I can tell you, once I was in a very remote part of our country,
Yeah.
but the people reading newspapers, and we publish much about the United Nations, I think more than in this country. And they read somewhere that we are paying annually $80 million to the budget of the United Nations and about $200 million to the budget of all international organizations. And the people asked me very bluntly, is it worthwhile paying so much?
And you said,
And I explained to them and used this, what you said, as one of the first arguments to explain to them the role of the United Nations. Then I cited important and positive decisions of this organization. For example, the colonization process started in 1955, started actively. After the certain decisions on decolonization were adopted by the United Nations. And now we have twice more members of this world organization than in 1959. And those are young developing countries. And for these young developing countries, United Nations may be the only political shelter, because they don't dispose of large forces or political influence to defend for their interests. But the United Nations is a very good place, a podium for defending their interests. There they find solidarity with other such states, and we understand very well this role of the United Nations. We respect it.
Interesting point that he makes of political shelter there. Tell me, do you think there is any adverse effect on the Soviet populace with the very fact that the UN is located here? Now, a lot of the people in the United States have a sort of, it's not possessive exactly, but they see it as almost an American institution, which makes no sense, of course, but it's natural because it is located here. But surely if there's that effect here, there would be the reverse effect outside of the country, and I'm wondering if you had noticed that in your countrymen.
Well,
did they have a negative feeling at all about the UN? Did they?
No, I shouldn't
sense?
say so. No. Very positive attitude, but certainly sometimes disappointment that even with what we have in the UN Charter and with all these meetings, huge machinery, we cannot reach more. But there were decisions in the United Nations in the form of GA resolutions or Security Council, which were very useful. For example, test ban. You know that in 1963 there was concluded a partial test ban, which improved the world's atmosphere. Very important agreement. And the discussion on these subjects was started in the United Nations in 1954, when India brought this issue to the attention of all countries, and supported by public opinion, American scientists, and so on. We were the first nuclear weapon states who supported this idea. And all the decisions of the United Nations in this regard were a good contribution to the conclusion of partial test ban treaty. Same happened with the non-proliferation treaty, which you know is also a very useful agreement supported by both the United States and the Soviet Union. And now we are continuing our very active campaign, or may I call it fight, for comprehensive test ban. And here we are supported by a large majority of the United Nations members. And only the United States last year voted against 4 resolutions pertaining to this subject. And the United States was isolated. When a correspondent asked me, are you happy that the United States was isolated? I said, no, by no means, because we wanted to be together with the United States on this issue in order to reach a comprehensive test ban.
You know, it's interesting in a sense. The United Nations is, in a certain sense, a concept that is a political entity beyond the sovereign nation state, as we think of it and so forth. The United States of America is a country that went from a history of having been a confederation to a federation. Certainly the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, with a wide diversity of culture, wide diversity of language, a huge 8.5 million square mile expanse, a tremendously diverse country that's been brought together under a political umbrella, as it were, as a single nation. Can you see the possibility of it as a model for us developing, perhaps it's a little bit looking out, or the UN being a model, for the development of an increased transnational identity on the part of the citizenry of the world? And if so, do you think it might be wise for us to see greater power, if that's the right term, or authority vested in the UN and UN agencies in a kind of quasi transnational identity that could put some real power at the hands of the UN, rather than very often some people feeling sovereignty still resides at the nation-state level only? I just wonder, do you think it would be wise for us to try and strengthen, let's say, in a political sense, the institutions of the United Nations in a plea for a transnational identity to which we could all repair, or not?
Does a transnational identity mean world government?
Well, maybe toward some sort of a world government, or some sort of a world policy bringing together diverse peoples and diverse views of the world, or a general philosophical conception.
I know, but it is I think it's a good question, and a very important one, because you are right that what could be meant by transnational. If it is in the meaning of supranational, then nowadays and in the near future it wouldn't play, because the sovereign states should suppress their national interests, which will never happen, and the differences between states, peoples, and so on, depending on their social economic order, will remain for many years ahead. And this supranational authority, I doubt very much that it will be accepted or admitted neither by the United States, nor by the Soviet Union, nor by Chinese People's Republic, etc., etc. But if you mean transnational in the sense that countries would understand better their national interests in the context of international issues. For example, the prevention of nuclear catastrophe. It's an issue, because only after this question is solved we can speak surely, definitely about development, the solution of many other international problems. Then here it's maybe a transnational meaning, but in this sense of this word. And well, if you come to a compromise, you have to sacrifice something, sometimes to sacrifice in order to get to an international agreement. You see? And this could be understood and done better within the framework of the United Nations, with all the relationship between different countries. You see? And I talked often to ambassadors from different countries who are working on bilateral basis and multilaterally here. And they all say that if you are stationed in a given capital, you cannot feel so much this international spirit as you have an opportunity to do in the United Nations.
Yes, indeed, I should think. Yeah, I wonder, do you think, she spoke earlier about the satellites and the communication, that we are just historically becoming increasingly a global village, as Marshall McLuhan would have called it, that the international economic order is more closely interrelated than it has been, that the movement toward recognition of an identity with, let's say, the whole of the world's citizenry and they're part of individuals is emerging historically through time? Are we becoming more of an international, thinking of ourselves in international terms than perhaps we have historically? I don't know. It's perhaps trending on the same territory, but it's moving in that direction, or the human affairs are moving toward increased sense of world identification or a broader identification?
When our first, you call them astronauts, we call cosmonauts, but it is the same.
Indeed, 25
meaning.
years.
Yes, indeed, 25 minutes. 25 years ago, Yuri Gagarin was shown recently on US TV, and he was surprised, being the first man to see our planet from outside. He was surprised how beautiful it is and how small at the same time it is. And with these present communications, with the interrelationship in economic field and cultural, scientific, especially with the space technology and the space and nuclear age, we're really inhabiting not such a spacious apartment in the universe. And that is why we have to use the opportunities offered to us by the United Nations in order to learn ourselves how to live together. And you see, we say always that ideological differences will persist many years, but it doesn't mean that military means, armed attacks, should be means for solving such ideological differences. For example, today I referred at the beginning to the barbaric bombardment by U.S. forces of Libya. All right, someone agree or disagree, etc., about the policy of Colonel Gaddafi, but it does not mean that the United States should conduct its policy with the military means, with the help of bombers and so on, or aircraft carriers. Now the diplomacy of gunboats, it was called during the First World War and on the eve of the First World War, well, starting from the end of the last century. Now we may speak about the aircraft carriers diplomacy. But all the differences should be solved by political means, and this is an obligation we took on ourselves in virtue of UN Charter.
Then the UN is not going to be considering this morning's or last night's actions as part of a civil war then. In other words, in the global community, is perhaps more what it should be considered.
Well, if I correctly understood your question, civil war, by that term we mean something happening in one country.
We all have an interest in this. It's a global community.
International conflict which was produced by certain actions on the part of the United States. And you will see clearly the reaction of the world governmental public opinion during the debates in the Security Council, which is underway now. Security Council started its meetings at 3 o'clock this afternoon.
We are talking just briefly here about the Libyan situation, which is very current and so forth. And Mr. Reagan, in his address, invoked Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Maybe you could share with us what Article 51 provides for and how you see his quoting or putting forth Article 51
yes,
as
he said this
rationale within the UN Charter for this activity that the United States engaged in.
I think that the reference to Article 51 is irrelevant, and those who prompted this argument never closely studied the UN Charter. I quoted Article 2, which envisages non-use of force. And we, for example, at different fora, suggested to the United States to develop this non-use obligation into an international agreement, either bilateral or multilateral, and so on and so forth. United States always refused to do that. They said Article 2 of the UN Charter is enough. And now we understand why they refused to do that, because they needed free hands in using force in such cases like Grenada, for example, or Libya. And Article 51 envisages a right of state for self-defense in the case of an aggression.
Territorial aggression, supposedly?
Yes.
Yeah.
Territorial aggression? Well, is that delineated?
Aggression, armed attack. But here, nobody faced such an aggression against the United States. Certainly, terrorism is bad. I'm not speaking about who committed what and the reasons of a specific event. We ourselves condemn terrorism greatly. You know that last year we voted with the United States for the same draft resolution of the Security Council against terrorism.
Yes, indeed, there's
and
commonality there.
At the very August rostrum of our last party Congress, 27th Party Congress, Mr. Gorbachev explicitly condemned terrorism. It's how he put it in English, I don't remember, ugly face of terrorism in whatever this demonstration it could be. And we'll be the first to condemn terrorism. But we condemn terrorism, individual terrorism, and all other forms of terrorism, even state terrorism, which we consider to be these actions against Libya. But whatever motives, they cannot justify the use of force by huge superpower against a small, sovereign, non-aligned state.
What would you say your defense, or rather, your definition of terrorism is?
Well, the definition of terrorism, if you take a legal term, is maybe rather complicated. I don't remember it by heart. But terrorism, it is the use of weapon or different acts in order to intimidate or other people or peoples in order to...
What would the purpose of it be then? What the people here in the States see as random acts of terrorism, of course, are not random. But what are they intended to accomplish specifically? Things are more clear-cut in a declared war, for example. But what are these acts of terrorism intended to accomplish? Do you know?
Well, I think there are different acts of terrorism. For example,
La Belle Discothèque.
Belle Discothèque. It's a very, it's a case which deserves very severe condemnation. And here there should be found people who committed that. They should be punished, or whatever organization they support such people. But to use this very sad event for bombing residential areas of the capital of a sovereign state and other cities, that is inadmissible at all. And that is, as I said, prohibited by UN Charter, because even this conflict, this case, could be solved with political means.
So in effect, you would say it was not self-defense, but something more bordering on revenge, which is
it's not
quite
only
a bit
revenge.
It's quite a bit uglier.
It was a very pre-planned act of aggression against Libya, because since 1981, the United States government, and it was published in many newspapers, they wanted to eliminate Gaddafi from the political scene. And there were different plans worked out to implement this idea. And Libyan coast is not for the first time bombed. It was done, for example, before this last case, it was done in March 25th, you see. And no motives could justify such brutal actions when civil population, we don't know exact numbers, but there are many civilians who died during these bombings. Yeah. Well, the United States doesn't like the leader of this country. We also don't like the leaders of some of the governments. And is it a pretext for bombing these states, the capitals?
Yeah, the terrorism might be
unacceptable.
Okay. Yeah, the terrorism itself might be the act of people who feel, in their own sense, either economically or politically vulnerable and feel as though the normal way of having intercourse with the people, the powers of the world and so forth, are failing them in a way, so they feel in a desperate kind of situation in order to react to these conditions of terrorism. I suppose in a sense that might also then reflect the economic and political differences that do exist among the nations of the world and so forth, and ultimately to find a solution to these questions there will be more terrorism, one presumes, and so forth, so we begin to look at. Ultimately, we're going to have to try and deal with the core issues that are creating the sense of frustration on the parts of people that lead to the terrorist activity, and try and lead toward a greater equity among the peoples of the world, and also to a greater political understanding among the nations of the world. And it seemed to me, that's an ultimate question that's open to the leadership of the world, it seemed to me the United Nations as an institution which we've now had since 1945 is a major one that has been able to create this umbrella of transnational identity and so forth. And it's very important that we do be able to maintain that institution just as a place for talking and for allowing it to continue with its good work. But that's a very important responsibility that we have as we begin to move ahead to trying to address some of these issues. But it's a major question, and ultimately it's leading toward a world of where we could all live together in terms of some sort of economic understanding that is perhaps seen as being more equitable on the part of the peoples of the world. And how we can arrive at that is the question that's open to us.
It was an interesting point you made. I felt that in referring specifically to Gaddafi, he has naturally a very highly negative image in this country. But if he, as a leader, were more personable, perhaps likable, would the populace, would the citizenry of the United States be so quick to say, yes, this was the right thing to do?
Well, I suppose it's all in the interest of trying to have a greater degree of understanding. If we could understand one another better and try and find some commonality of understanding between peoples who see things in diverse ways, that's the challenge that I guess is open to us all, really, to avoid, in a certain sense, the ultimate absurdity of a nuclear holocaust and so forth, all of which are broad questions that we could go on discussing at greater length and so forth. But we did want to talk some here about particularly the institution of the United Nations, which you're involved with. We certainly thank you very much for participating here in this particular segment of the program. I'd like to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That it's been a great pleasure speaking with you. And I'm sorry we don't have more time to go into some of these issues in greater depth, but maybe we can on another occasion. And I would remind you then, in the cable television audience, it has been your pleasure to have the perceptions of the deputy permanent representative to the United States of the Soviet Union to the United Nations, that being Vladimir Shustov. Of course, I'm sorry, Vladimir Shustov. Happy to have been able to bring those perceptions. I would remind you again, it's been the program's been co-hosted this night with Marilyn Mock-Vos-Savant, and Marilyn, once again, it's been a great pleasure having you here as co-hosting the program. Again, Mr. Shustov, thank you very, very much for participating. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Good night. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for this particular segment. We'll be coming back. See you next week. Good night.